Hello, happy Halloween, and welcome to the Halloween Marathon, where it's a compilation of all of the videos that were Halloween themed for this year. If you haven't seen all of the themes, go ahead and check out the Instagram. There are going to be some exclusive themes, such as the Siren, as well as the Evil Doctor and other ones. And comment down below which one is your favorite theme, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Hello, in this video, today we'll be talking about, we are going to talk about polymorphism, the bizarre symbols on your keyboard, the bone-chilling lorem ipsum, HTML entities, the history of the web. Let's get to it. So when we are talking about polymorphism, we're talking about different objects can take on many different forms. And if you break down the word, it actually means poly, many, and morphism is that it changes into different forms. And we actually technically already apply this into our real life. Because if you think about it, if you think about your own self, you would have many forms. Such as for me, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a teacher, I'm a worker, I'm a developer, and the list goes on and on. I can take on many forms, and I'm just a single object, a single person. Well, the same way goes with coding as well, is that some objects within the coding realm can also take in many forms. The reason why that we need polymorphism is that we may need to be able to share our data between our objects. And one good way that we discuss is that we talked about having inheritance, of having everything a parent has, a child also has. And that is a sense of polymorphism. The child is essentially an iteration of the parent. The other thing is that when we are doing that, we're able to share some sort of logic. If we want to be able to share logic, we might use polymorphism to do that. And lastly is encapsulation. Usually with encapsulation, it means that we are bundling things into one particular type of logic. So with encapsulation, what we mean is that when we are having objects, we want to bundle into common objects that are related to each other. And when we bundle our code together, we may be able to clean up our code a lot. So this is an example we used before. And as you can see here with polymorphism, within this example, you can see that an animal, as well as a bird and a parrot, they all have different forms. They all have different elements because of inheritance. For example, a bird is technically also an animal, and then a parrot is technically a bird, which is also technically an animal as well. And that's what polymorphism is that it's the idea of objects taking on many forms. And here, we can also say that we're able to share data between each of these objects because of this relationship, because of all of the different forms it has. So here's another look at it with our tree model. With the root is animals, and a bird is a type of animal, and then a parrot is a type of bird, which is a type of animal. So with this case, if the data cascades down, then we're able to pass from parent to child, parent to child. So with that, we can also share our logic and encapsulate that this certain polymorphism is going to be about animals. Now, this is where polymorphism comes into play in the real world. Again, we already used this example, but it's a really good example because with this user object, we can also see that the employee is a different kind of user. It just has different fields. It has the employee ID as well as the start date and any other logic related to the employee. Not only that, is that it's also a user. So Since it's also a user, it also has an email and a password and the ability to change the password. So that is the power of polymorphism. Again, polymorphism just means that objects can take on many forms. And that's to our advantage. It makes everything for us to have access to when there is some shared logic. And it also helps us encapsulate data that is related to each other. And finally, everything the parent has, the child also has. Now, you probably are familiar with most of the keyboard, but the symbols I'm talking about are the symbols here that is listed on this slide. And with these symbols, they actually do mean something inside of different programming language. I also want to let you know which one is which and also what they're called. That way you know where they are and how to recognize them. We'll go ahead and look through it from left to right, and then we will also see some examples of some of these symbols here. Now the first one is going to be right by the number 1, and the little swiggly, that is called a tilde. And then the one right below it is actually called a backtick. Usually with backticks is mostly for multi-line strings or for some string interpolation, but really you may or may not even use the backtick. And then tilde, I rarely see that used at all. So those are the tilde and backtick. The other one is right above the 1. That is the bang. And some people call it the exclamation point, but most coders, most programmers, they call it the bang. And usually with the bang, we are going to do it with not. So that is not equals, or to undo something, we usually use that with a bang. Sometimes we use it with important, with styling, and that is also doing with anything that needs to be important. The next one above the 2 is going to be the @ symbol, or the @ sign. And you usually see these with email addresses, but in programming, it may mean something like being a variable name of different scope or referencing something within the code itself. So that's the @ sign. Now the next one has multiple names. This is called the octothorpe, but other people call it the pound sign, the number sign, the hashtag. But in most cases, we usually call it the pound sign or the octothorpe. But with this, we usually use this with commenting or with some sort of a programming language signifier, but typically you would see these as comments or string interpolation or something like that. The next one is the money sign. And money sign is really useful for using with variable names with different scope, or you're using them with something else inside of the programming language. And this one is real well known inside of the US because that's also the same symbol as the dollar sign. So that is the money sign there. Here is the percent sign or the modulus. And with the percent sign, we could use it as a certain percentage of a certain number, or we could use it as a modulus. And with the modulus is actually a different type of evaluation with having returned the remainder from the left divided by the right side. So that is the modulus. Now for this next one, I typically don't see it used as often. This is the caret, and I usually just see it used with the math symbol of having it to the power of, but this isn't a common thing to use in programming. So this is the ampersand or the and symbol. And with the and symbol, one of it could mean something else in the programming language, such as in HTML, you could use the and to represent the start of the HTML entity, but with 2 of them, that actually does mean and. So typically you would use the ampersand, but 2 of them to mean the and keyword. This next one is going to be the star or the times button. And I typically use this with doing some multi-line comments or any commenting system like in Ruby or Java. They typically use a star with a combination of a slash with it for commenting. Or you can also use it as multiplication, like times. That also works as well with the star. This is also called an asterisk as well. Now here is the one right next to the 9 and the 0. When you press shift, these are the parentheses, and you'll actually be using a lot of opening and closing symbols within your programming language, and parentheses are one of them. And typically you could use them like in an if statement or in functions or other types of methods or calling a function, you would use the parentheses themselves. Other than that, parentheses are also used for grouping elements to be evaluated first. So for example, since programming languages go from order of operations,
anything inside of the parentheses will be executed first. Now, the next one is pretty hard to notice because they do look pretty similar on your keyboard. This is the underscore and the dash. And the top one is actually the underscore and the bottom one is the dash. And sometimes people call it underscore, and then the other one would be called a line. That's totally up to whoever uses it. You can call it whatever you want that makes sense. But with underscores, they're typically used as naming or anything that has to do with combining multiple words. You can combine them with the underscore if you're doing that type of best practice. And I usually see underscore used with other types of variables or other types of tools. They would incorporate some sort of an underscore. Now with the line here, typically you would have multiple lines to do a comment, or you can use it as a minus operator. That also works as well. This one is for plus and equals. That one's pretty self-explanatory and probably self-recognizable. So with the plus, you can increment or add or even doing string concatenation with the plus sign. With the equal sign in most programming language means assignment. It actually doesn't mean equal. So that's what you need to know with your programming assignment if the equality is the equal sign. In most cases, maybe 2 or 3 equal signs signifies equality, but with one that typically means assignment. Now here's the next set of grouping elements, and these are the curly braces, the mustache bracket, the curly fry, those types of brackets that is on the top of the one right by the P. And these are another thing that you would use to group your elements or use them in like a hash with a key value pair. So these are the next most common ones that you would use is these curly braces or the mustache brackets that you would use an opening and a closing one for all of your functions or whatever you need inside of your programming language. Now the one right below the curly braces are called box brackets. That's what I like to call them by, or you can call them array tags because in most programming languages, arrays are denoted with a box bracket, an opening and a closing one. And that's what you would mostly see them with is those box brackets there is with tying in into arrays. Now this one is the other one that seems pretty confusing is right above the enter or return key and it's a straight line and a little like diagonal line. So the straight line one, that's actually called a pipe. And actually with 2 of those pipes, that means the or. So we have and then 2 pipes equals or. And then we have a slash. You can call those like a forward slash. I'm pretty sure it's either the forward slash or backward slash, but most people will just call it slash or forward slash. And you typically use this forward slash to escape out of strings, or if you need to do them in some sort of your regex or something inside of a string or comparison. And typically we don't really have to use forward slashes unless we really have to. Next is the colon and semicolon. The colon is the one on top, that's the 2 dots. And then the semicolon is the one with a dot and a comma looking one. So with these 2 items, you typically don't use a colon by itself. You typically pair that up with a colon by something that you're doing a key value pair is, or you're assigning or denoting something, and you use that with a colon. With a semicolon, in some languages, that's how you would end a particular line of execution. So every single line in some programming language, they have to be ended, and you can end them with a semicolon. So that is both the colon and the semicolon. Now here with the double quote and the single quote, we typically use these for strings. And with the double quote and single quote, you actually need 2 of them to make up a string. And it doesn't matter if it's double or single, they both are considered a string if it's in between an opening and closing quote. Now we have the greater than and less than, or I like to call them the angle brackets, or some people call them the alligator brackets, whatever you want to call them. But these are typically for either evaluation within math, like greater than or less than, or you can use them as opening and closing tags in some languages. Especially in HTML, with the opening tag, you have 2 of them, and then a closing tag, you have 2 of them with a slash at the end for the ending tag. Now, the ones that are right below the greater than and less than sign, the first one we'll talk about is the comma. And typically with commas, we use them like a how we use them in punctuation. We use them like how we're listing out multiple terms. So for every element, they're separated by a comma. That way it knows that every element is its own element. So that's how we are using commas. Same way that we are using them in English language or how we typically use them. We're just using them like it inside of the programming language as well. Now we'll talk about the period or the dot. So with the period or dot, it could mean different things in different languages. But in most cases, you're able to do dot to string, or you can do dot state, and it'll grab a individual object or function or whatever it is that you need. The other thing is that it might mean some sort of operation. Like in React, if you do three dots together, that actually means spread or the rest params. So it could mean different things in different languages, but in most cases, it would be like a dot something for it to work. Now we are at our final weird symbol inside of our keyboard, and that is the question mark and the slash. Again, this slash is actually a little bit different. It's actually angled differently than the forward slash. And typically with question marks, you may use them as like punctuation, but in most cases you might use them as a ternary operator. So with the ternary operator, you symbolize that you're starting a ternary with a question mark, and right by it, that is what happens when the expression is true. The slash itself, you may have to use it inside of some sort of a string or an operation with regex or anything like that, but maybe most likely you'll use them in some sort of a division. So these are all of the weird symbols that are on your keyboard. Now you know how to identify them and a little bit of brief info of what some of them do. Now that you know them, you can now know how to identify them when you're learning to code, or where to find it, or what the syntax is inside of your programming language. That is it for this video. If you have any comments, feel free to list them down below. I am doing a little bit of a different style of presentation just because I'm sick of the one that we've been doing over and over again. Let me know what you think about it being this style. I am going to have a switch within the studio, so is why you can't see my face inside of this video. And it's a little bit of a different video than normal, but as soon as I get everything set up, you'll be able to see my beautiful face again. I hope you all like the series thus far of the Halloween spooky theme. And for this theme, we're actually going to get a little bit bony with the lorem ipsum today. So first off, what is lorem ipsum? Essentially what lorem ipsum is actually a placeholder text that you can use during your design or development phase to help you visualize and design the layouts or certain placement of certain ideas or single components that you put inside of your designs or web pages. And the reason why we have something like lorem ipsum is, if you really think about it, if you are planning for content and the content requires tons of text, you're not going to have a bunch of lines, or you have to come up on the spot of your own text, even though later on you might even disregard that text. So a better thing for you to do is just to do some sort of a placeholder text. And a lot of placeholder texts out there, they're not as popular or as most used as lorem ipsum. So that might be something that you will use in your design phase, or when you're developing. You can just set aside a certain area and then kind of play around with the styles, or kind of play around with the layouts with the text there, because that will give you a much more realistic approach of what the words and layouts and designs are. And the reason why this is so bone chilling is because of this. From first glance, lorem ipsum looks like this. It looks like lorem ipsum dulcet asmo, etc., etc., etc. And you can use a couple words of these, a whole paragraph, a couple sentences, or a few pages with this content. There's a lot of lorem ipsum for you to use. And all it is it's just placeholder text. You don't need to know what it means or what it says or anything. And it doesn't say anything bad or anything like that. It just looks very different, but we don't really care how it looks like for now, because we'll later on replace the lorem ipsum with actual content. This will really help us to put some placeholder content, and it will help us to use that in a much more realistic way. Because if you take a first glance here of the first paragraph of lorem ipsum, it has a bunch of words with a bunch of links. So that's much more coherent with the English sentences because of how the way it looks. So it's easier to lay it out in lorem ipsum than actually trying to do it yourself. And that's really the main purpose of lorem ipsum, is placeholding. And you can add lorem ipsum anywhere that there should be text, and then you can play around with it to see if it works. If you need more like styling, or maybe try to lay it out at a different spot, lorem ipsum is a great way to do that. And then later on, once you come back, once the designs that are approved, or when your website is at a good point, or when your design or whatever it is that you're trying to do is at a good point, you can then later on refactor it instead of saying lorem ipsum to be the actual text that it should be, like the history or like the about paragraph, something about the company, things like that. So lorem ipsum is just a good placeholder for now, and then later on will be refactored to actual text. Now you're probably wondering where it came from, and it's actually written in Latin, which is a pretty dead language. It's not used as often anymore, and I'm pretty sure it's very rare. And you can really learn it with specialized classes, or if you really research it, because it's not currently used as frequently as its own language anymore. And with this lorem ipsum, it actually came from a lot of different Latin words that are all bunched up together. And over the years, lorem ipsum actually got together with a much more coherent way of just random Latin words all together, with a bunch of different sizes and a bunch of sentences together within Latin. And that's how it came to be, and it actually got improved and added on year after year. And then in certain parts of lorem ipsum was actually spoken in Latin way back before like 100 AD. So this was a very old language that is still being used, but only certain bits of it actually does make sense. So we're still using a really cool thing of history here is lorem ipsum. And it actually became the industry standard of placeholding ever since the 1500s, is that in the 1500s, they actually needed some lorem ipsum or some placeholder to put inside of newspapers or inside of certain designs aspect. And instead of trying to figure it out yourself or have some dummy text, they actually use lorem ipsum for a placeholder text. And that's really cool. And ever since then, we've been using lorem ipsum for placeholding text, or a certain versions or different versions of it for placeholding. And you should use it as well. It's a really good tool for you to have. And a lot of text editors, and you can always find it online, comes with lorem ipsum for you to use when you're designing or when you are creating content or applications. You can always have that tool in your disposal, because you don't want to sit down and come up with like a few sentences just to fill up a certain paragraph on the screen or on a design. That's just inefficient. So a better thing to do is use something that was already there, or something that was already in use for the last 500 or so plus years, and many more years to come. And there's actually so many versions of lorem ipsum, because if you're really bored with lorem ipsum, which you may or may not be, it really doesn't matter. There's actually a bunch of alternatives that you can use. Some of the alternatives include like bacon ipsum. And bacon ipsum is just a bunch of bacon related text within their placeholder text, like pork chop, meatball, bacon, etc. Or cat ipsum, everything having to do with a cat or a story or whatever it is that a cat does. You can use cat ipsum. Or zombie ipsum, which is a bunch of zombie related words. Or there's even hipster ipsum, which does a bunch of hipster terms. The DeLorean ipsum, which is a bunch of movie quotes from Back to the Future. And even there's one of cheese ipsum, where it lists out different types of cheese for placeholders. And these are all good placeholder texts that you can use. And there's so many other placeholder texts out there, different versions of ipsum itself, like every single superstar, movie star, they probably have one, I'm pretty sure. Like anything that's very trendy, it probably has it as well. So there's other versions of lorem ipsum. Even if you don't like one, you probably would like or use the other. So this is a lot more fun if you try different versions of it instead of using the regular one. So that's pretty cool as well. So I would definitely look into other versions of lorem ipsum if you're interested for something a little bit different for your placeholder text. And that's pretty much it for this video. Essentially what lorem ipsum is just a placeholder text, and it's nothing too crazy, or it just looks crazy and intimidating at first, so it's nothing that is any bone chilling type of environment. And I would really recommend that you would use it inside of your workflow. This is part of an ongoing series of the Halloween theme. If you haven't seen any of those videos yet, be sure to check it out on my channel after you check out this one. So let's get into HTML entities. So here is the premise. There are some characters and symbols inside of coding that you may need to use inside of your projects, but you can't really use them because they might give you an error, or they might not even exist on your keyboard or anything like that. Some of them include like the greater than less than sign, slash, the copyright, money sign, even a quote, because quotes are symbolizing strings, some other symbols that you may not have access to as well. And these are some of the characters that you can't use unless you do them a certain way. And if you try to use them, you might get a syntax error or a command not found. In HTML, if you have a greater than or less than sign, you might think that it's a HTML tag. So if you want to implement that inside of your text, then it might not display it properly, because that might give you a syntax error, because it might think that you're still opening or closing a tag. Some of the languages, they might be a little bit more lenient and they may assume that you're doing something else, but in most languages, something that you shouldn't really apply is something that you should always prepare for, just in case for those situations that you might need to use it, but it might not let you. The other thing is that if I want to do like a euro, like I only have access to E, I can't really do a euro, right? And this isn't the real symbol of a euro, and I could find it online and have that implemented inside of an image or something. That might take a little while, that might take a little bit too long. And even the copyright one, like I only have access to C, so that might not be the best option for me to use. And not a lot of people recognize C as in copyright, they recognize the actual copyright symbol. So some of these implementations, they're not really realistic, or they might not work the way that you want them to work. Now you do have a few options that you can do. The first is entities, is the main topic of today's video. And the second is escape sequences. These are certain sequences inside of strings that you can use to have them be a little bit of a space or a little bit of a tab, or even slash or certain symbols, but it is very limited of what you can use for escape sequences. The better thing to use is actually entities. So with entities, you can have access to all of the spaces and tabs, as well as any symbols that you can think of and more. So that's why I would really recommend entities. And it's pretty simple. For the copyright symbol, here you can actually refer to it three ways. And we'll talk about those three ways here. And as long as you have it referred one way, then it will show up properly inside of your code in the final display. And I would recommend you use entities more than escape sequences. I would use escape sequences here and there, mostly for strings, but for actual visualization, I would turn to entities itself. So entities are very much solely part of the HTML language, but you can actually convert that into other things if you need to. Or if you want to use HTML or other languages that has HTML in it, you can use entities in it as well. So that's something to keep in mind when you are using entities, is that it's mainly for HTML and web development, but there probably is something that you can use in your language of programming. Now here is the structure. If you want to use an entity, you need to have the and symbol. This is the and symbol that's right above the 7. And then after that, it will be the entity name, or whatever it is you're referencing it. and then a semicolon at the end. That is the one right next to the L. All that together, it will make up a certain kind of combination, and HTML can recognize that combination to be a sort of entity, and it will show up as part of a single symbol like this. And this is a lot more better for you to recognize as a copyright symbol rather than just having a C. And there's multiple ways that you can recognize an entity or reference an entity. That is going to be with either the entity name, like this one right here, like the copy, or the entity number, which is this one right here. And there is a bunch of entities and they all have their own unique number. Or it could be a construct, which is going to be a combination of letters and symbols, as well as numbers here too. And they have a certain construct for each of the entity that you're using. The most common one that I've seen is either going to be using the entity name because it's very self-explanatory and it's well enough thought out that you know that this is going to be something related to copy or the copyright. And the second one would probably be the entity number. And then lastly would be the construct, since it's just so much more to type. And developers are a little bit lazy. They rather type less than more. And they rather be more specific than really broad. Because if I look at this or this, I don't know what it is I'm typing, right? But if I do this one here of the entity name, I know that that has something to do with the copy. So that is the entity structure. You can use one of these references, but regardless of what kind of references you need, you always need a and symbol and a semicolon at the end. Now here are few of the many entities that you can use. Symbols like quotes, because again, quotes are very reserved for strings and programming languages. So if you actually do a quote, it might think that you're opening or closing a quote. So that's why using an entity instead to represent a quote, it will still give you the same result, but it won't give you an error. It won't assume that you're opening or closing a quote. Here is the R symbol, and then we have pi here, and euro, and infinity, and even some wacky arrows. And I know some languages, they need some accent marks, so you can do some accent marks inside of entities as well. And these are just the few of the many entities that you can use. I'll link down a reference website down in the description box. That way you can see all of the cool ones that you can use. And this is from another source. This isn't something that I created, but it's something that I really recommend. So take a look at that. That is a good one to take a look at. And again, don't memorize all of them because there's just so many information and so many entities that there are for you to use. I would just know where to reference them, which is going to be the reference sheet, and maybe memorize the ones that you would use the most, like maybe euro or dollar if you're working in that type of environment, or the copyright one, or even the space or tab one. Those are very much used a lot with. And I would recognize and remember what the number is or what the entity name is. That way you can reference it again. And then if not, then you can always look it up, right? You can always take a look at the reference sheet or do a quick Google search and it'll give you the entity that it is that you're looking for. And then you can use it as much as you want and it won't give you any errors. And that is HTML entities. Now let's actually talk a little bit about the web, and that's how you're viewing this video and also how we have a lot of stuff that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. But you can't really talk about the web without talking about the internet. And the internet actually came before the web, and they're actually two different things. So essentially, the internet is just a network of information and information exchange. And technically, we do have something like the internet before we had the internet, before it was invented, but it wasn't as efficient up until the internet was really flushed out and fully implemented. Now, information exchange before the internet, you often would use something like letters or telephones or Morse code or telegrams to communicate to other people through a huge distance of land, right? And if you want to know something, you have to go look it up in an encyclopedia or visit the library to know what a thing is or what a word means, things like that. And encyclopedias now are all virtual now. Like no one actually owns an encyclopedia no more. But encyclopedias used to be bunch of editions from A to Z of different types of information that is provided for you. And it's updated yearly with some encyclopedia publishers. And that's how people get their information during the time. You can also exchange information in person, but that's actually not as efficient because you can't really talk to someone unless you travel to them. And also, if you have any news back then were divided within newspapers or posters or word to mouth and things like that. That's how people got their news, is with these types of information exchange back then. And this doesn't even go through relatively recently, too. Even further back then, further where Julius Caesar or when the Romans or Egyptians or any other of those back then, they all use some sort of information exchange, like writing stuff in hieroglyphics or writing stuff on parchment or having pigeons relay information during the world wars. And even back in the caveman days, people still have information exchange with some sticks or some cave drawings. That's still kind of the precursor of information exchange. And it wasn't really perfected up until the history of the internet. And the history of the internet really revolutionized how we exchange information. And the idea was proposed and thought of way before it was actually implemented. But when it was then implemented, it was then implemented in the 1950s. That's when governments and military needed to have information exchange to kind of make sure all of the troops and all the information are all correct. Because during something like research or something like a military operation, they need the information as fast as possible. They can't just wait for a letter to come to them at every single moment when they're in the heat of battle, right? So they actually implemented something in the 1950s and have it proposed. And it wasn't until in the 1969 it was finally implemented. And it was implemented for researchers and the government to exchange information. And it was shared through a wide area. It wasn't as worldwide, but it was in a wide enough area that spans across a few couple states. And the first nodes, or the first node of the network, were actually built in UCLA, or the University of California in Los Angeles, and also in Stanford as well. And they were able to communicate and exchange information between the two schools. Later on that year, the University of Utah, as well as the University of California at Santa Barbara, also got added to the list. And within that year, not only were they able to exchange information from school to school, they were able to do it in a way where they were spreading information across the states. And with this, they expanded to other universities and other government and research facilities that needed to be part of this network. Because you can only be part of this network if you had these individual nodes that are close to you. And that's how you become that network. Later on, they have nodes expanding all the way up to Hawaii, which is across the ocean, and also in other research facilities around the states, and eventually, slowly, they've gone around the world. But that still poses a problem with information exchange, because if you think about it, if you need something and the only place that you have it is within this network, you have to be part of the network to have it. And also, you have to be lucky enough that you were near some of these nodes, some of these networks. Like you have to be by California or by the University of Utah or Hawaii. That way you can access the same information that they are able to access. Or else you're still doing those traditional ways of sending letters or having newspapers and things like that. You are still having that issue that isn't really versatile as it should be. Now, this is where the World Wide Web comes into play. In 1989, someone named Tim Berners-Lee invented a way for information to be shared not only in small nodes, but all over the world. And that is a revolutionary idea because you're not having to be in a sort of network. You can be anywhere on the world and you can still access those same type of information. And that really helps around a lot, including military, government, and also other researchers and researching ideas that can be transmitted across worldwide. And that is something that he brought to the table. And it was proposed at first, and it wasn't really a huge priority. It didn't seem a big difference or a huge revolutionary idea at first, like all ideas, right? But with this idea, it slowly implemented and evolved into what we know as the World Wide Web today. And what he brought to the table at the very beginning of the World Wide Web was the first hypertext transfer protocol, a new language called hypertext markup language, the first ever web browser as well as a web editor, and a HTTP server software, the first ever web server, and the first ever web pages that kind of tells you the story and what he wants to do with these types of tools. Those were the first ever kind of websites and web ideas that he brought to the table. And that what really down the line revolutionized the website industry. This is what started off is these first ever things right here that really start off and kicked off the World Wide Web. And now, not only do we have a transfer of information, we also have other things that we have through the World Wide Web, and we can exchange it anywhere inside of the world. We don't have to be part of a network anymore. We can be outside of the network and still have access to the same exact information as other people can. And obviously, there are some things such as like government or military and research stuff that is inside of lock and key, and that's just a different type of use for the World Wide Web. You can have your own pockets or your own network still in the World Wide Web, and you can still save that and share it wherever it is you need to. Now, at the very beginning, it's just a bunch of websites, and you don't have access to a internet unless you have a huge computer. Right? And computers aren't as versatile as it is right now. Nowadays, a computer can fit in your pocket. But back then, computers are actually huge. They're actually the size of buildings. They take up a couple floors, a couple of buildings. And that's what you need to connect to the network. You need to connect to the internet. And that's not really ideal for the common day household to have a whole building just for a computer. And in most cases, most households didn't, right? Or they didn't have a huge computer that they're able to work with. So only access from government or research or universities have access to the internet, only has access to a huge computer that can support the internet and be able to access the internet. So at first, not a lot of people were using it. It's only those people that need to use it, they were able to use it. But then it came into a boom. And this is a boom where the industry kind of took off. This is where things kind of went from 0 to 100 real quick. Because not only did the access change, more and more people were starting to use and starting to change the industry. And it first started off with a commercialized computer. Computers were then commercialized, so not only do the rich of the rich or the people that need it can have a computer, now anyone can be able to have a computer. So leading industries such as HP, Dell, Apple, Microsoft, other huge tech companies, they all develop a commercialized computer. That way they can all have access to certain tools. And that was kind of a race between all those big tech giants to have something for the average day household to have a computer. And from there, it then kicked off again. Then people wanted to think about portable computers. That's where the ideas of laptop comes in. And maybe implementing it within a cell phone and in a smartphone and later on inside of your car, inside of your appliances and cameras and so many other things, they were then implemented the computer. And not only that, some of these items were then have access to the internet and then has access to Wi-Fi and the World Wide Web. So that's what really revolutionized the use of the internet, is what the ideas and evolutions of the computers. Not only that, a lot of businesses saw a huge potential with the internet, with the World Wide Web. With the World Wide Web, you can span your whole entire service or your whole entire idea throughout the whole entire world. And that is a really good marketing strategy for most businesses, if not all businesses. So some of the businesses, they thought that the World Wide Web as a place for you to have another marketplace that they can do their business in. They are able to share services and products such as store or trades or stocks or even information and entertainment as well as video games on the World Wide Web. That all started off on the internet for them to kick off and also expand their own businesses. That also contributed to the big boom as well. And as more businesses hopped on, more web pages popped up as well. Things such as advertisement for some of the products and some providers like YouTube and later on Netflix and all these other care providers that you can do all on the internet itself. And you can have access to them through the World Wide Web. The ideas that people thought of is really bringing in creativity of how they can utilize the World Wide Web. And this gives you a wider reach for everyone throughout the whole entire corners of the earth. And it spans across different languages and different backgrounds. You can spread your information out now through the World Wide Web. And there's basically now a website for almost anything. You can think of it, there's probably a website for it. And if not, you can always create a website for it. And that's where the industry really boomed, is with this creativity, with this reach, with all of these ideas coming inside of it to kind of change for what it was to what it is currently right now. And that's awesome. That's amazing. Eventually, the World Wide Web will later on evolve into something more in the future. It can kind of grow into something that we can have a wider access into more information and more information reach. Because if you really think about it, there are some countries and are some places that don't have access to internet, or much of less running water or electricity. So they don't have access to the internet. But later on, maybe there's a way where you can make computers more affordable, or you can have the internet more affordable, things like that. That's more of the evolution that could come to be. And not only that, maybe later on, further down the years, we can communicate in between planets, in between universes with the World Wide Web. You can have websites coming from Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, all coming towards the moon or something crazy like that. And that's where the evolution is projected to be, is that everything that is going to happen later on can be contributed with the internet and also the World Wide Web. We can have communications in different languages. Why not alien languages as well, with other lives inside of our universe? That's what's coming up with the evolution. And it doesn't start from pioneers back then. It actually starts off with ideas that you have right now, with really cool, innovative ideas that can really pioneer what the World Wide Web is into something that can really be super cool in the future. And that is the wicked history of the World Wide Web. If you like it, please subscribe and hit the like button below, and I will see you in the next video.